Welcome to Close Listening. I'm Zach Morgenstern, joined as always by silent co-host Ludwig von B. And today we are talking about a record called The Basement Tapes. So I've been going through Bob Dylan's albums in order. This one comes out in 1975, but it's a bit confusing because it's actually material that was recorded in the late 60s between Blonde on Blonde and John Wesley Harding. This was Bob Dylan getting together with the band. For those not very familiar with your 60s and 70s music history, the band was a band consisting of Canadians and Americans, most famously Robbie Robertson, but also Levon Helm, Richard Manuel, Garth Hudson, and Rick Danko. They started out as a group called the Hawks, backing the Canadian rockabilly singer Ronnie Hawkins, and at various points they served as Bob Dylan's backup band before developing into a Rock and Roll Hall of Fame group themselves. So the Basement Tapes is basically Bob Dylan with the band jamming together in various recording studios. I don't know if they were all basements, and coming up with some pretty good songs. For years, these songs did not go published. Bob Dylan, after trying desperately to become famous with his first two albums, spent a lot of the rest of his career trying to run away from fame. And the Basement Tapes project seemed to be one way of dealing with this. He was going to record all this music with his buddies in the band, and he was not going to sort of formally release it as an album. Nonetheless, the acetates, and I don't fully understand the process of this, were released as various sort of loose bootlegs and singles over the years. And finally, in 1975, and I think this was more for the band's purposes than for Dylan's, it was released as this unified album. And apparently there was some disappointment with that because it was missing two of the most famous songs from this project. I Shall Be Released, which I don't think has ever been associated with an album, and The Mighty Quinn, though in fairness, The Mighty Quinn was already released on Bob Dylan's self-portrait album. So let's talk about some of the tracks. So it starts off with a couple of songs with bluesy feels. I like the first one, Odds and Ends, a bit more than the second one, Orange Juice Blues. Weirdly, there's references to juice in the first song and not really in the second ones. But right away, you notice what is special about this album, namely that the band, Rock and Roll Hall of Famers, unsurprisingly, are a really good band. You know, so often with Dylan music, it feels like the lyrics really come first. So with its early albums, it's just him and his acoustic guitar and harmonica, and sometimes that's just not enough music. And then later, even when Bob Dylan went electric, sometimes it feels like the backing music, the electric guitars, the organs is a bit paint by numbers, whereas the band gives Bob Dylan's music a nice, lush, complete sound. Track 3 is the first really special one, and it's called the Million Dollar Bash. So musically, it sounds very similar to Stuck Inside of Mobile. And that's the sense I get here, that various of these songs sound kind of like ideas that had showed up either on Blonde or would show up in the upcoming John Wesley Harding album. But, you know, unlike the mysterious poetry of Stuck Inside of Mobile, this song really just seems to be about appreciating going to a really good party. Again, this is Bob Dylan's project about just appreciating, enjoying what he's doing and not, you know, putting out something profound for the fans and for the critics. Track 4 is a composition by Robbie Robertson of the band. It's called Yazoo Street Scandal. And in many ways, it sounds like a Bob Dylan song, both in terms of how the singing is actually performed and the loose biblical theme of a 40-day flood. Yet it has a sound of its own. It's a very echoey vocal. It has a mysterious organ. So Yazoo Street Scandal is sung by Levon Helm, the drummer and mandolin player and regular vocalist for the band. And that's the thing with this record. Part of the reason it is a double album is because, well, it's more a Bob Dylan album than the band album. The band certainly jump in with songs that are really just theirs. Next, we get a song called Going to Acapulco. This song feels like the kind of thing I would have wanted on the very incomplete Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid soundtrack album. It has a Tex-Mex feel to it, but it also has a realness to it that makes it more than just sort of like the literal stuff we got of Bob Dylan singing about Billy the Kid. It has a more of a poetic, emotional quality. So it might be about, you know, some, you know, Tex-Mex figure finding refuge in a Mexican resort town, but it's also just a more general allegory for finding respite from this wicked life. Next, we get a song called Dear Katie. This is a really solid band track that is written by Richard Manuel and Robbie Robertson. And again, their sound just comes through so wonderfully. It's soulful country singing that I guess is a bit of resonance because it's subverting gender roles a little in that Katie is the sort of free-spirited, romantically unavailable person when I guess traditionally the male is the heartbreaker. Another good thing about this record is it kind of goes back and forth between different sounds so you don't get too bored. So sometimes you'll get a sort of sparser folk sound as we get on the next track called Lo and Behold. Next, we get a song from Rick Danko, the bass player of the band, and he sings a song about being in love with the blues singer Bessie Smith. So Bessie Smith had died before I think all of the members of the band, except possibly Garth Hudson, had been born. So obviously there's no real connection there, but it's just kind of cool to hear musicians from this much later generation expressing love for a musician from an older generation. And though it's a romantic song, it's not a cheap or exploitative thing. It's just genuine, cute, sentimental love. The next song on the record is called The Clothesline Saga. So this is apparently a parody of Bobbie Gentry's song Ode to Billie Joe. So I don't know Bobbie Gentry well. I don't know if she really counts as a one-hit wonder, but this is the kind of thing I wouldn't have caught if I don't look it up. Basically, Ode to Billie Joe is a kind of talky country song where its premise is, people sitting around a table in a small town, and the singer is traumatized by this local suicide, and everyone around her is just acting normally, and she can't tell if they're also traumatized or they're suppressing things or what's going on. And basically, with Clothesline Saga, Bob Dylan sings in the same style, and he sort of parodies all the references to the mundane in Ode to Billie Joe without bringing in the suicide trauma. So I feel like it's the kind of thing that if you knew the song Ode to Billie Joe well and you saw Bob Dylan jamming to it in the moment and sort of cleverly imitating its style, that would be a cool parody. But otherwise, it just sounds like kind of a bland country song. We get a song next called Apple Suckling Tree. It sounds very similar to the classic folk song Froggy went a courting and he did ride a hum. And while the lyrics for this one, aren't as much fun as a frog marrying a mouse, what we do get here is just another example of the band sound playing nice, particularly the organ playing from Garth Hudson, who I believe is a classically trained musician. Again, sometimes the organ on some of the earlier Bob Dylan songs just sounded like filler noise, whereas this song sounds so good because every musician is doing their job to the best of their ability. Next, we get a song called Please Mrs. Henry. Hard to say exactly what the song is about, but the chorus is clearly giving the band members a lot of fun. Bob Dylan is laughing while he's singing it, and it's undoubtedly a catchy tune. The first disc of this double LP ends with a song called Tears of Rage. Again, it's good that we're shaking up the sound. We go from the silly Mrs. Henry to this slower military march tinged kind of epic that seems to be talking about the abandonment of the ideals of the American Revolution, though it's fairly vague in its subject matter. The second album opens with another big sound. It's a mysterious song called Too Much of Nothing. It could be a song about behaving badly while being drugged out. Another thing I notice on various of these songs, and this is something Bob Dylan had been doing for a while, he just name drops various characters. And it's as if one thing he's saying is, there are many bad decisions you can make as a musician, but if you have connections, be they to places like Acapulco or be they to people, as was mentioned in the earlier song, Lo and Behold, you can sort of help get your life in line. The next song is called Yay Heavy and a Bottle of Bread. I kind of just like this one because of the title. It has a sort of weird pirate sounding thing to it. Musically, it sounds like the song we would get on the John Wesley Harding album, Frankie Lee and Judas Priest, except with a bunch more psychedelia. And the lyrics themselves, they seem to be about using your imagination to kind of make the mundane or upsetting events of the world into something more magical and adventurous. Well, the comic book and me, we just caught the bus. The poor little chauffeur, though, she was back in the bed on the very next day with a nose full of pus. We get a traditional folk song called Ain't No More Cain, given the treatment of the band's rich sound. We get a sort of folky song from Dylan called Crash on the Levee that continues the Noah's Ark imagery and musically sounds similar to his song,
The Drifter's Escape.
The sort of big classic song on this record is called You Ain't Going Nowhere. This is one of the first Bob Dylan songs I ever heard, and I don't know why. Maybe my father has like a copy of the Basement Tapes, but it has sort of very mysterious Dylan-y verses, but a sort of very simple chorus. Ooh, ride me high. Tomorrow's the day my bride's gonna come. And it's recorded in a way, so it's far and away the hit on this record. Not that Dylan was going for any hits with this relatively private music, but that one you hear it and you're like, it's the hit just because the drum beats emphasize all the right things to get the chorus enter your head. And it seems to be, an early version of what Bob Dylan would go on to do on New Morning. He's sort of declaring to the world that, he's done with being famous. You can try to be powerful like Genghis Khan, but at the end of the day, you ain't going nowhere. It's best to just wait to get married and end up in the easy chair. There seems to be an obsession with people named Henry on this record. I don't know what's going on, but previously we had a song called Please Mrs. Henry, and the track 8 on disc 2 is called Don't You Tell Henry. It has a kind of Chuck Berry feel to it, and it's about all these farm animals being afraid of a guy called Henry. I don't know if this is because he's a meat farmer or if it's something more abstract than that. We get a song called Nothing Was Delivered, doo-wop / gospel kind of song. I don't know, something that you could imagine someone like Sam Cooke singing. It mixes the kind of snarkiness we got from Bob Dylan and Blonde on Blonde, but because the band gives the music a more beautiful sound, it kind of softens its meaning. Nothing was delivered, and I tell this truth to you, not out of spite and anger, but simply because it's true. Then we get another song with a very catchy chorus, and one of the weirder stories behind it is called Open the Door, Homer, but you would not know that if you didn't read it, because there is no mention to Homer whatsoever. The chorus actually goes, Open the door, Richard. It's a great, soulful vocal from Bob Dylan, and I talked about the idea that seeking salvation in other people. It's sort of encouraging this Richard guy not to be afraid to sort of seek out his friends, come over. As for why they call it Homer and not Richard, I believe it's because the writer Richard Farina was nicknamed Homer by some people, but there might be conflicting stories about that. After that, we get a bluesier song called Long Distance Operator, which makes it sound like lining up for a phone booth is like lining up to get into heaven. And finally, the album ends with a song called This Wheel's on Fire by Bob Dylan and Rick Danko. So similarly to Tears of Rage, both of these discs end with a sort of dramatic, emotional, kind of haunting song. The message here seems to be we're rambling towards death, but maybe we'll meet up and find some friendships in the afterlife. So overall, this was a very enjoyable record. As with most double albums, I think the sort of density of material makes it hard to enjoy it all if you listen to it as an album. So if I were to cut it down into one album, I might have $1 Million Bash, Going to Acapulco, Please Mrs. Henry, Tears of Rage, Too Much of Nothing, Yeah Heavy, and a Bottle of Bread, You Ain't Going Nowhere, Open the Door, Homer, and This Wheel's on Fire, and then maybe find a couple of the band songs to fill it out. Maybe Katie's Been Gone and Bessie Smith. The cover art, I know it's hard to see from a distance, is really cool. You have people dressed up as this various characters. This woman's shirt, I know it's kind of blurry on my camera, says Mrs. Henry. We also get an Inuit appearing man in the back, which I guess is the Mighty Quinn, even though the Mighty Quinn didn't end up appearing on this collection. I did not mention every song on here. There were a couple, Ruben Remus and Tiny Montgomery, that seem to be creating characters, which I guess goes with that cover art. So yeah, I very much enjoyed listening to the Basement Tapes. The only one of these songs I knew previously was You Ain't Going Nowhere, so it was largely a new experience. It's always great when you find songs by a classic artist you'd never heard from before. And I am looking forward to coming out with more Bob Dylan reviews going forward. I'm Zach Morgenstern. This is Ludwig von B. See you next time.